Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Karen Turnbull.
Hi, and welcome to the Festival of Learning Spaces, Designing with Nature. So a really fitting topic for World Environment Day. We have 4 really exciting presentations on a broad range of subjects to do with nature in landscape. So looking from landscape design, mental health and well-being, and also, and importantly, the climate emergency in landscape. So I'm going to ask each of the presenters just to introduce themselves very briefly before we go on to the presentations. I'll start with myself. Obviously, Karen Turnbull from ADP. I'm the sustainability lead for ADP, and I work with on different projects across the practice, looking at sustainability strategies from healthcare, education to commercial sector. I also work with a team of sustainability champions across our practice, looking at implementing our sustainability strategy, and also R&D, looking at aspects such as embodied carbon and our internal sustainability toolkit. I'll go to John Newman, who also works at ADP, and if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm John Newman. I am the Landscape Director at ADP. And obviously, I work across our 7 studios. I also work very closely with Karen and her team and championing sustainability and environmental solutions for landscape.
Okay, thanks, John. Andy Gibson from Mind Apples, if you can introduce yourself.
Hello, I hope you can all hear me all right. Very nice to be with you all. Yes, so my name's Andy. I guess I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective than some of the other panelists because my background is in health and well-being. I run Mind Apples, which is an organisation that does training, public health, campaign work, schools programs, all trying to encourage and support people to take better care of their minds. And I actually call myself head gardener of Mind Apples, although I mean it more in the sense of gardening your head than in actual gardening. It does make some very interesting offers on LinkedIn, though.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Kath Lester from IBI Group, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, Kath Lester. I'm a landscape architect. I work for IBI Group, based up in Manchester, but I lead our team of landscape architects across the UK and work across a full range of work sectors, including education. I also get involved with elements of landscape architecture, such as landscape and visual impact assessment.
Okay, thanks, Kath. And then Ian Taylor from Field and Clegg Bradley Studios.
Hello, yes, I'm a partner at the London office of Field and Clegg Bradley Studios. I'm a member of the Higher Education Design Quality Forum, visiting professor at UCL IEDE, and a member of the EDGE.
Okay, right, so we're going to go through each of the 4 presentations and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end of that. So if we start off with the ADP presentation, Ian, if you can put that on your screen. We've just had a bit of trouble actually sharing the presentation, so hopefully Ian can do that. Great, thank you.
Can that be seen?
Okay, so basically, yeah, a natural education. So we're going to look at 10 ways to bring nature into the classroom. So if you can go on to the next slide, please, Ian. Right, okay, so obviously we've introduced ourselves. So John and I are going to do a joint presentation, just a little bit about ADP. We've got 7 studios across the UK, and we're specialists in education. That's from early years right through to higher education. But also we work with within other sectors, so looking at healthcare, residential, community and workplace. So next slide, please. Okay, so we believe that good architecture and just as importantly, good landscape are really powerful in terms of creating positive places. And there's 3 strands that we really value. So sustainability underpins everything, but feeding into that very much are people, health and well-being, and also communities to make really strong, cohesive places. Next slide, please. We've picked up this quotation from Last Child in the Woods, a book by Richard Louv, and we think it really sort of encompasses what we're talking about, and I'm sure it will sort of touch on all of the talks we do today. But this is about the importance that nature plays in terms of childhood education and development, and it picks up on the last sort of 30 years where there's been a decline in children accessing nature through the use of screens, but also due to not having access to suitable areas to go and play or whatever. And the role that actually nature is really intrinsic in terms of our development and our education, and how we can go about sort of addressing that and what we can learn from this loss. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to be looking at designing with nature. So how we use nature in the design process, and that's about bringing nature into the learning environment and how we interpret the learning environment so we can use outdoor space to make the most of natural assets. So we're looking at 10 ideas and 10 ways to address that. And one key thing about that is that some of these measures are really simple and they're cost effective, and we think that's really important in terms of promoting using nature in design. Next slide. Okay, so why is nature important for learning? So there's been plenty of studies and research into why nature is really important, and it's really sort of fundamental in terms of sensory, cognitive, physical and social development. And the one aspect that I found really interesting was a bit of research that looked at comparing sort of a man-made external environment compared to a natural environment, and how the natural environment really fuels the imagination. So it's really important in terms of creativity and imagination, and it's the sort of wide open space that you get and that interaction with the natural environment that really fuels this, and really kind of is so much better than sort of a man-made environment. And I think it's really important, not just for sort of early learning years where young children get to play with mud and water and that sort of physical environment, but through to older years as well, so climbing trees for cognitive development and coordination, and then through to sort of in terms of informing us of science and the natural world and being able to identify species and understand connectivity in nature. So it's important all the way through, and it's forging that sort of strong understanding and love of nature that then goes on into your adulthood, and we can become stewards then of the natural environment. It's really important in terms of our work and creating spaces that we pull in the natural environment in terms of what we're developing. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to let John now go through 10 ways that we are looking at how we bring nature into the classroom.
Okay, next slide, please. So, wild imagination, using external spaces all year round. We have a couple of examples of photographs here. The bottom example is Barton's Primary School in Bognor Regis. We were emulating some of the natural groins in the seaside, and we came up with beach huts. And primarily for storage areas, and then we thought, well, why storage? Why can't they be a space for the children to play together and just use their imagination in play? Set up little cafes and little houses, and all sorts of utilizing their imagination in those spaces. The above slide obviously is looking at just being outside in nature, and we just think that's really important. I mean, how many of us went to school and brought things in to paint, flowers, bits of leaves, that type of thing? Why didn't we go outside to paint? Why didn't we have that experience? And how much more richer could that experience have been for us? It's cost effective. The weather's not always that bad, so we can just get out there and enjoy nature and actually benefit from that. Okay, could I have next slide, please? So obviously being outside, looking at the school grounds, looking at the fun spaces and using them all year round, we've got to actually put some measures in place to do that. So quite often we're asked to design trim trails, and I think that really opens up the sites for exploration, but also to segregate the different spaces and take you into other areas. So trim trails are really important, and nature trails and pathways. We can use different surfaces on those trim trails, and they can lead to different areas, obviously. And then we've got an example of in a city school. So in Pimlico, we've got this roof garden. So there's a connection with viewing nature from and the green from the roof terrace, even though there wasn't a lot of land around the school itself that we could use, and allowing the children to have this play space on the first floor with some simple materials. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Number 3, exploration and discovery. I think in the current situation where we've been in lockdown for a while, lots of people have been talking about these bug hotels and making them. I think lots of children have made them themselves, and they can be quite grandiose in the end. What a wonderful exercise to do and get the children to do and be involved with, and how to I think us adults are actually learning a lot from having these around us as well, where we're attracting different insects into our gardens and spaces, and watching them move around and do whatever they have to do. In Coventry, we did this little garden in Alderman's Green, and we made a pond and we made an allotment garden, and that just gave the children the opportunity to actually plant this area up, and then obviously study in that area. And, what a great teaching resource it was. We had wildflower meadows in there, obviously the dipping pond, and different habitats. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So we think there's also a very a great need for this sensory connection. This is a wonderful example of actually having a sand area and it not just being a formal sand pit. So there's lots of tactile things that children can walk on and sit on and be up against in this environment. Obviously it's a shelter that keeps the rain off and keeps the sun off, which are quite important in different environments. But we actually think our design should include areas like this that are a little bit more informal, allowing the children to develop a lot more in these spaces. Next slide, please. We think also that reflection spaces are really important. So areas that can be quite quiet, or where you can sit and listen. You can sit and read and then listen to the wind going through the planting, through the trees. You can get a bit of shade if you want to. It's really important to get the children out into the external environment and let them experience that space as it is.
I think also on that, John, it's also providing spaces that children may, they might be shy, or they might just want a bit of quiet space, just a couple of children together rather than being in a crowd. And it gives that opportunity by providing variety of spaces, for either large groups or small groups, or just for a child to go and have a bit of quiet time.
Yeah, that's right, Karen. I mean, I know from being a non-sporty child that it was important to have quieter areas when I was at school. I'm sure there's a lot like me. We have the next slide, please. So also looking at spaces that school children can actually go to if they're not provided in their own school grounds. So this is a community building. I forget the name of it now. It's Stansfield Park. And this is looking at a swale environment that has been created from this building. This was an early photograph of the development, but also now that's grown, that's such an area that the children can go to and explore. And there's lots of different opportunities for looking into the ponds, studying the wildlife around that area. And just generally, I think there can be lots of connections between schools. I have my own allotment in Edgbaston in Birmingham. And I know from a recent experience, I heard some children playing down at the end of my plot. There's a brook, and I heard some children playing down there, and I could hear them, going, shh, shh, keep quiet, you'll give us away. And I went up to them just to make sure they're okay. And then I thought they're just having a wonderful time playing in this brook in a bit of woodland, and nobody really knows where they are, but they know they're in a safe environment. And I think as children, when we were children, we were allowed to experience those conditions. And I think it's really important that we can have those facilities for the children at the moment. Can we have the next slide, please? Something else. This is Braywick Primary School, and this is built next to a nature reserve. And the building footprint takes a lot of the site up. It's just really a great space because the children can actually just come out of their classroom and to this outside space, and they can make that connection visually with the trees and with the wildlife that's actually use this area. So even if there isn't enough space on the school grounds, at least we can look around us and see what we can connect with.
Yeah, and I think the benefit of Braywick is this is on the it might be on the ground floor, but on the upper floor you just have a wonderful, being at a higher level and you're sort of in the canopy, you have a wonderful view outside, and it just gives a different perspective of the surrounding landscape. So often being on an upper floor, it's like the play deck at Pimlico, you have that vantage point, which is great in terms of views and just being immersed within the landscape.
Can we have the next slide, please, Ian? So we all know the value of food and growing our own vegetables, and again, it's a very current topic, because I'm sure we've all been sat there planting seeds. Well, I certainly have myself, and I think it's just so important for children to actually have that experience and to nurture and look after their seedlings and let them grow and actually understand where their food comes from, and also start to question their diets and how healthy they are eating. And I think this really also sort of sows a seed for thought in terms of those budding gardeners that start off at a young age. This will whet their appetites, definitely. Next slide, please. So engaging spaces, yeah, we need a lot more external spaces, because I think it's great taking the classroom outside and maybe not taking the chairs with us, but just taking, just utilizing logs and rocks and the environment around us. This is just an example of what's been made with a sail shade, and just being able to have an external classroom outside. I think that's really important. Something we also look at is, if there are mature trees on site, or even if we're planting new trees, it's great just to have a little area that the children can go in a small group and have a story read to them, or somebody can read out a story. Again, it just segregates away from big play areas and provides quieter areas. We have the next slide, please. And this is our last slide, but this is looking at the landscape and how it can be multifunctional. And this is a job that we did down in Chesham Prep School, which was to provide a dipping pond for the client. And you can see the pupils are obviously utilising the deck to observe the wildlife in the pond. But also there's a huge big sort of wildflower meadow behind. And again, you've got the storytelling tree at the back there with the seating. And it just allows a small group to mingle there. But also looking into this area, it just gives the opportunity for older children to actually come out, study something. They might be looking at this in the curriculum anyway. But the teachers can bring them out and say, look, we've got this example here, how fabulous is this? And it just gives you another teaching resource outside, which is really important. And that's our 10 points.
Yeah, but we have another slide, John.
Oh, no. Okay. Next slide then, please.
The next slide, please. Thank you. Ian, could you do the next slide, please?
Yeah, sorry, I
disappeared.
am trying to. Every other slide has changed in just the same way. There you go.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So just to wrap up, really, this is just a little bit of feedback from 3 of the children at Braywick School. And I think some of the points they've made are it's just really rewarding to hear those comments, because just makes you realise that they appreciate the natural world, and they the design that we've envisaged, and the positive aspects that we were looking for, that they've actually they're enjoying them. So that's really lovely in terms of hearing that. So I think, one more slide. I think it's 2 more slides. The next one, just quickly through, and then the final one. So thank you. Yeah, thanks for listening to that.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Andy Gibson from Mind Apples. So maybe that's it. Great, thank you.
All right. Hello. Very nice to be with you all. Thank you very much for that. It's nice to see all the photographs. I'm afraid I haven't brought visual aids because I thought it's all about nature. We should just talk to each other. But it is really nice to see some pictures of nature, and I'll be talking about why that's good for our minds in a minute. I suppose a bit of background just on why I'm here is that I'm not coming from an urban design perspective. Although we work with organisations that do, but what we do at Mind Apples, we're trying to encourage and support everyone to take better care of their minds. And a large part of that involves working with companies such as design consultancies, but we also are doing work in education, in schools and universities. And so I'm here with our charitable hat on, because a lot of the work we've been doing is trying to explore how we can promote well-being in schools and support teachers and staff and even pupils and the parents to try and talk more about what their minds need, to promote a culture of good mental health and well-being in there. So I'm talking about this from the angle of the people rather than the buildings, though I'm very conscious that the two relate very closely, as you could see from that first presentation. If you do want to know more about what we're doing, then mindapples.org is the website. I'll post that in the chat at the end, and you can see a bit more about our work. But I wanted to start this particular first part of my talk with, as all talks should, a story about a chicken, because everyone needs a story about a chicken. But there's been quite a lot of work over the years on trying to figure out how to make chickens happy. And the reason for that is because we eat chickens, and we like to make sure that the things that we eat are happy, because we're a very strange and complicated species. And so there have been lots of different experiments trying to figure out what is the environment that helps chickens to thrive. And so they tried different combinations, sizes of groups, but particularly indoor spaces, outdoor spaces, giving them large, long-distant views, but also barns and different combinations. And in the end, what they did was look back at the evolutionary heritage of chickens and jungle fowl and the kind of evolutionary background of it, and they looked at the kind of environments that the birds would have evolved in, and tried to recreate them. And it turns out that the conditions that chickens really like is small chicken-sized bushes that they can hide behind, but also long views so that they can see predators coming. And you set up those, and chickens then relax and feel a lot happier about it. And when I heard that story, it was actually my dad who told me that. It made me think, what if we put as much effort into thinking about what made us happy as we do about chickens? And perhaps we could be taking that same approach with all of the things that we're doing. And so a lot of what we've ended up doing at Mind Apples, and my interest in a lot of this, is in looking at at human nature, and particularly our psychology, and why we've evolved the systems that we have, and how to make the best of those systems so that we can create conditions for us all to thrive, so that we can create environments, whether that's social and cultural or built environments or workplaces, schools, whatever it might be, to help us to be at our best and to work and live in a way that fits with our nature. And it's very, in some ways, very true to the old Stoic tradition. I'm sure there are many fans on here of ancient Stoic philosophy. I know I am. And a great key principle at the heart of Stoic thoughts in ancient Greece and Rome was live according to nature. by which they didn't simply mean go out and get your hands dirty or grow some plants. What they meant is live in a way that is true to the nature of yourself and the nature of the world around you, rather than trying to pretend we're something we're not, or that the world is other than it should be. It's a kind of approach of engaging with things as they are and trying to work with that energy. And it actually does fit quite nicely with a lot of modern design approaches, the ways of designing that are looking at the nature of things and trying to bring out all of the assets of those, whether that's the people using the space or the materials used or the environment around the landscape, trying to harness that rather than to try and come in and reform it. And so with that in mind, what I wanted to give you is just a few thoughts from the perspective of a psychologist or someone working, supporting people, and mainly adults, but also in schools with trying to improve their well-being and live and work well. Is just a little bit about the principles of psychology that we might want to think about if we're trying to design environments which humans will thrive in. And I'm sure that there are many people who are in these kind of conversations who know a lot of these principles. So I may not be telling you anything that you don't know, but certainly I hope to give a little bit of the why behind it, a bit more of the kind of the background to it. And I'd say that this is particularly pertinent to schools and to educational environments. My background is very much in education. I like learning things, explaining things. It's really my whole career. And both my parents were teachers, so I guess it's genetic and you can't escape your fate. In the context of schools, in the context of educational processes, it's really important that we try and think about the quality of the environment and the natural world around us, and trying to work in particularly natural features and a connection to nature into the environments that we learn in. And a lot of this has to do with the psychology of learning. And there are different mindsets with which we can approach the world. A lot of the work that I end up doing in workplace contexts is talking to people about the role of emotion. That emotions, rather than being something we can shove to one side and be professional or be rational, in fact, everything we've learned over the last few decades about emotions is that they're integral to cognition, that your emotional state will affect how you see the world, how you react, how you behave. And particularly what your emotional state is doing is filtering the world. There's too much information coming in to take it all in and absorb it all intellectually. And so on an unconscious level, your mind is filtering, calling attention to things it thinks are important and dropping away from things that it thinks aren't important. And your emotional state will affect the way that works, because when you are in a more reactive mode, your fight or flight systems are up, you're going to be noticing more threats. And generally speaking, if you're in a bad mood, you'll remember more negative things, you'll notice more bad things around you. And we've all had days like that where everything just seems bad. You walk out and everyone seems rude and getting in your way, and you miss the person who's holding the door open for you because you're not scanning for that. Similarly, you have other days where you think, isn't everyone lovely? The sun's shining, isn't it great to be alive? And probably the world is giving you similar information, but you're selecting from it. And this particularly affects learning, because essentially what we end up with is states where you can be in a very reactive mode of wanting to defend, and it's very hard to learn and explore and be creative in those states. And then you can be in a more open state where you're looking for opportunities, the rest and digest systems are there, and you can explore, find new things to try. And that is a much better state for people to learn. And a lot of historically, I remember from my time at school that the environment seemed more designed to impose authority and make kids feel afraid. And I think over the years we've moved away from that and fortunately started to think about what we can do to make kids feel safe and able to try things, which is of course going to be a lot more fertile for the way that we think about learning. And so what I wanted to do is, apart from just giving you that kind of that frame for thinking about this, about what we can do to help people have that kind of filter, is to give you just a few principles about what that might mean in practice for the way that we design environments and the way that we think about creating learning spaces. And the first thing is to say that nature really does seem to aid creativity and exploration. There are lots of studies that suggest that natural scenes help us to be more associative in our thinking, connect information together, which is very good for then retaining it and being able to recall it and use it later. And even just looking at pictures of nature, so just looking at that previous presentation will have made us feel just a little bit more creative. So that's why Microsoft continue to bombard us with natural scenes on our screensavers to take our mind off the fact that we're using Microsoft. And so a lot of this is about trying to figure out what we can do just to feel part of it and connected to it, to see those scenes, because it seems to be quite good for that associative, playful, connective type of thinking. Another thing about this, though, is that it is about variety, that it's not just a matter of saying we need one particular type. Nature can mean many different things, and so it doesn't just have to mean we need greenery, although that does seem to very much help. But the sounds are important, different kind of quiet spaces, loud spaces, that feeling if you ever go into butterfly enclosures or jungles where there's a different noise to when you're out in grassland. I think a lot of that's a part of it, but it's not about saying there's one right way to do it. The huge amount of this is about saying that it's about the variations, the ways that we can let people experience different kinds of natural environments, loud and quiet, challenging and peaceful, all kinds of different combinations around it. So there isn't a one size fits all with this. The other thing I'd say is that views matter, and that silence matters. So views particularly, we talk about nature, but actually a lot of what we're talking about is about perspectives, about the views that people can see. And so being able to see out of a classroom window and see nature, but also one of the more underrated things I think in designing these things is to get people up high or give them long horizons to look at. And there is some suggestion that long horizons are good for calming the mind, for helping us to get more into that relaxed, receptive state of mind. That maybe that there's some evolutionary element to that, of being able to see far and see that there's nothing bad coming at us, and so it may help us. So people like to climb things, people like looking out to sea, so it's partly about the vistas, but it's also about being able to go and hide away from people or get a little quiet corner. And one thing on silence, which was mentioned a bit already, but the idea of quiet spaces, it's useful in all kinds of ways, particularly for just if people feel shy or if they want a little bit of a breather or whatever like that. But also just periods of silence seem to be extremely good for restoring our capacity to pay attention. So just 10 minutes of silence seems to be really good for attention restoration, to come back and concentrate better. So these pockets of natural environments and silence can really help with just being able to come back and concentrate better in class. The fourth point is to make it interactive. This isn't just a backdrop. It's not about just seeing it. It's about going into it. So there was a study by the University of Derby and a Wildlife Trust, I think, where what they looked at is over 30 days of just interacting with nature. They saw big increases in people's well-being, happiness levels, general health, reductions in anxiety and depression, in ADHD in kids. But it wasn't just that they were sitting in nature and chatting or reading a book. It was they were getting their hands dirty, planting things, doing things. And so it's about making it interactive. And in the context of particularly of healthcare outcomes, there's a famous study of hamsters in hospitals, which is of 2 hospital wards, one given a hamster which the staff looked after and the other a hamster that the patients looked after. And the one where the patients looked after the hamster, the patient's health improved a great deal. So that process of feeling some autonomy, some connection to it seems to be really good for us. And the 5th principle that I think is perhaps coming out through this is that don't forget the teachers. We talk a lot about the kids, quite rightly, but a lot of our work has been supporting teachers with their stress levels, their mental health, and particularly in state schools, it's a real pressure on the teachers to do a lot, and covering for people the kind of the financial pressures that schools are under. But across the school estate, it's a great responsibility to be a teacher. And one consistent thread with talking to teachers about how they manage their own mental health is that they always seem to have some place on the site where they go and hide, whether that's the back staircase or a bit in the corner of the playground or somewhere where they can't be seen, where they can get 10 minutes of silence and just remember who they are. And so actually thinking about planning for spaces, not just for the kids, but for the teachers to go and recover, because we pick up emotions from each other. And the teachers are doing a lot of emotional management with that. So as I wrap up, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, I hope that's a useful frame on these things. The final point I would say about this is that a theme running through all of our work, what we do at Mind Apples is ask people what they think is good for their minds. We often do installations, trees that we put up or that schools often make, and Apple cards that we ask people to write what they do. They're 5 a day for their mind. And so a lot of the work we do in schools is about getting the conversation going with the kids, the teachers, the parents, to ask them what they think is good for their minds. And it's a really good design approach too, to actually talk to everyone about what they think they need, what works for them, and make it possible to flex the environment a bit around those things and design some of the activities around that. So I'd encourage you to think about designing for well-being not as a kind of one-size-fits-all prescriptive model, but I think the analogy we use a lot is feeling at home. That we all understand the concept of home, but if you follow me home, you'll be at my home, but you won't be at home. You'll be at a home, but you won't feel at home. I hope that's clear. And the point of this is we understand what it's like to feel at home, but it's different for each of us. And so a lot of the role of creating natural variation in our spaces is so that we can find the little corners that feel at home to us. But it starts with asking everyone and valuing that and thinking about the well-being as a route to good design. And one of the key things that happens when you do that is you realize that we need to be connected to nature and not cut off from it. So thanks very much for your time.
Okay, thank you, Andy. That was really stimulating. Thank you. Really interesting. Okay, so Kath Lester. So are you ready to start your presentation?
Just test technology. I'm hoping you can see the start of another presentation.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank
carry
you.
on and tell me if not. Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time. I'm going to talk at a slightly more higher level in terms of what designing with nature means. But already listening to the two previous presentations, it's clear to see that there are some common themes throughout. So that's quite nice, in that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. So just bear in mind that there's some key themes to consider. So starting from the beginning, so just let me get... Okay, so I've already introduced myself. My name's Kath Lester. I'm a landscape architect. I work with IBI Group. I've been there for about 13 years and have undertaken many projects across many sectors, but lots of them have been within the education sector, from primary schools through to universities. So I spent a lot of those years designing outdoor spaces for the learning environment. And as the photos suggest on the presentation, I'm quite fond of the great outdoors and spend a fair bit of time out there with my family. It's been curbed a little bit in recent months, but I live in hope that I'll be out there again before too long. So what I wanted to do for the next bit of time was think a bit more about design with nature. And it's made me think in recent months that people have had their freedom restricted, found themselves connecting much more with the natural world. And for many places, the garden has become a sanctuary. Very much an experience of my own. And I've found myself spending as much time as I can outdoors, tinkering with the plants and trying to engage with nature myself. I think from the sound of what John was saying as well, he's found some solace in that environment as well. And I suppose for many other people that's been the case. And even for those people who unfortunately have been confined to the indoors, they've taken great comfort from just looking outside the window and watching the season change, particularly in the last few months as spring has come into play and there's so much change within the foliage and the landscape outside the window. And we've just heard from Andy about the importance of a view, and I think that has been quite pertinent for those people who have been trapped inside. Not surprising that as a landscape I enjoy being outside, and also as the plant nurseries opened in the last few weeks, I was one of the first ones out there. I was like a child in a sweet shop, and I think I've actually developed a bit of a habit for plant buying. I'm not sure my husband's that keen on it though. Anyway, we'll find that over the coming months, the impact of coronavirus will undoubtedly change the way in which our schools, our colleges, our universities go through their day-to-day teaching. But what I found, and I think has been reiterated in my own mind, is that over the last few months, I've got so much comfort and stimulation from being outdoors in the garden, and therefore it's quite easy to see how that potential of nature should be exploited within the learning environment. So as the world moves forward over the coming months, coming years, we really need to exploit the potential of nature and make better use of the outdoor classroom. So what I wanted to do is think about nature in a series of layers. So I've put some pretty pictures back up on the screen, so hopefully that's good for the mental well-being of those watching. But throughout the natural world, there are countless examples of how nature is layered and how that layering effect helps to enrich some kind of form or feature. So some of those images there demonstrate what I mean. And I think that concept can be translated from the design, or even the occurrences within the natural world, and those can be translated into how we design within the man-made world. And I don't mean that we should unnecessarily clutter the outdoors with gimmicks, but I think we should instead find ways to naturally integrate opportunities for children and adults alike to engage with the outdoors and better benefit their health and education. We should essentially use natural resources to our advantage. So using the theme whereby the outdoor classroom is a series of layers, we should, well, I've used this diagram really to try and illustrate my point. So in diagrammatic form, starting at the top of the slide, where I consider that the built form or a series of buildings to be, we should think of how nature works within that building. But then I think, as others have already said, we need to think beyond the four walls of the building, deeply consider what is situated within the site grounds themselves, and then also look further beyond into the community and how our school, our college, our university contributes to the wider community. So what I was planning to do for the next 10 minutes was just to look at each of those three stratas, if you like, those different layers of how the outdoor classroom can become a reality. So starting with what I've named the built edge. I mean by that the external space that's in closest proximity to the building, that the area where indoors and outdoors meet. I think it's important that we consider that as a zone, and that we don't just delineate the threshold of a building, essentially with a doorway. We should blur that boundary and think beyond the four walls. The doorway shouldn't be a stop point. It should be a gateway in and out of the indoors and the outdoors. And I think on a site which is constrained for space, this area becomes really important and is the place where people interact with their external environment. So thinking a little bit more about that from an architectural point of view, and bearing in mind I'm not an architect, I did marry one, so I've got a degree of approval, if you like, to reference that. We need to think about nature's biggest asset, the sun. We all know that solar power and aspects are fundamental to the development of a sustainable building, but we should also use those elements within our outdoor spaces. So we know that the UK climate is not always on our side. It's hard to believe in recent weeks, having experienced so much sun. But it's really important that our spaces consider the aspect in which they face, and that a south-facing sunny spot is more likely to be utilised than somewhere tucked away in a dark, shady corner. That's not to say they never will be, but I, for one, am much happier in a sunnier spot, catching a few rays rather than being tucked away in a dark hole. So aspect, creating a warm and sheltered outdoor space is really important for us to engage with nature. It's important in those sunny spaces that we make sure we have a connection through, there needs to be a degree of shading to make sure that everybody's accounted for. Not everybody likes the bright sunshine, and also for the safeguarding and safety of children, we may need to make sure that shade features in those spaces. Next, wanted to think about views, which Andy has usefully talked about a little bit already. But I think the view of nature through a window, it enables that connection with the external environment. And that is particularly important during times of poor weather or during the winter when we spend less time outside. So I think that when we design with nature, so when we're thinking about our outdoor spaces, we need to think about how they have an impact on the indoors. And to my mind, whilst long distance views might offer a connection with a more panoramic landscape, short distance views can also be dramatic and have quite a bearing on people's connection with nature and their well-being. So we need to give those due consideration. And I think someone mentioned staff and teachers. And I think for teachers who, let's say the office staff who spend every day in the same room looking out of the same window, their connection to that space immediately outside the building is very important. And making sure that they have sufficient visual stimuli to ensure that they engage with nature on a regular basis. So then moving on from views, I've said a little bit about making sure we enrich the space right outside the building. But I just wanted to use a few examples of how that can be powerful. Just thinking about one bench sat outside a door of a building. That bench gives a student or a member of staff somewhere to bob outside, catch a few rays of sunshine, or take a few minutes of fresh air during their lunch break, say. And in that 5 minutes, they just take the time to reset, pause for thought, and take a bit of time to themselves before going back into their working or studying day. Benches also encourage social interaction. So that person sitting there in their 5-minute lunch break, I'd like to hope they have more than five, will also at a bench potentially have the opportunity to meet with other people. And that degree of social interaction in the outdoors can be a very powerful thing. We shouldn't also underestimate the value, the power of soft landscape. So you often hear people talk about how planting has seasonal change, how it could be sensory, how it smells nice, but just those continual changing features as you look out of the window, as you sit at that bench in lunchtime, and you just see change, you see nature going through its course is really, really good for mental well-being. And then just thinking about those areas outside the building, that built edge that I'm referring to, those areas close to the building are really important for children during early years. You know, as they are put into new environments, they go to a new school, they go to a new part of the building. The scale of that environment close to a building can often provide comfort. You know, and just as children develop their own confidence, they like that scale to be close to home. That's not to completely disregard the fearlessness of young children as well. I know mine are just poised outside my door, waiting to burst in partway through this presentation, but children also want to explore the outdoors. So it's, as somebody has already said, it's about creating a range of spaces. So moving on then, just going down that diagram, thinking about the site, or that might be a campus in an HE environment. As the site opens out, nature offers countless opportunities to support learning. And I think we as designers, it's our job to create the springboard that people can metaphorically launch off and go headfirst into nature. The way in which people experience a site will differ depending on their own personality, but also it will depend on the scale of a site, the setting of a site. Is it urban? Is it rural? And whilst some might look to proactively go outside, we also need to consider those people who are more apprehensive about that. So again, we've talked about quiet spaces, that range of spaces. It's about giving people, whether they're children or adults, choice, options, different ways to experience the outdoors. So I've just lost my notes, bear with me a sec.
Hi, Kath. We're coming up to 15 minutes, so.
Oh, okay, I'll speed up then. So just sticking with the site then, really wanted to pick up on a few other key themes, one of which was topography. Now, I spend my life as a landscape architect dealing with topography. It's really important to manipulate landforms so that we can create different spaces, different environments for people to engage with. And also connected to that is the need for inclusive access. And we have a role to make sure that all those different environments are easily accessible for different people with different needs. Then thinking about how we work with ground conditions as designers to make sure that we consider surface water drainage and sustainable design, thinking about ways in which we can bring in SUDs to create different habitats, which in turn will have a knock-on effect and generate biodiversity potential. So really there's lots of elements within the site and the campus itself that we as designers have got a responsibility to consider. So just bearing in mind time and pressing on to the next slide. The last slide really, or penultimate slide, was about thinking about community and how we should never think that one site exists in isolation. There might be a site perimeter fence or a boundary, but every site has neighbours. And multiple people have said already today that we need to think beyond that site boundary. We need to think about the geographical and the social context of our projects. So, for example, how can we position new green and blue infrastructure to connect with adjoining areas of strategic vegetation or water corridors? How can universities perhaps that have got multiple campus sites think about how those can be connected together? And how can we safely share our sites with the public and allow access to our resource, thus increasing the way that nature can be benefited by the wider community? So in summary, the key points really were that we need to at times forget technology, go back to basics, slow down and engage with the natural world. And whether we're designing for a toddler or for an adult, we really need to exploit the potential that Mother Nature has to offer. And really designing is about layering. So not necessarily plonking in this new amphitheatre that kids can run to and they can have a formal lesson. It's about thinking about different bits of infrastructure, how they layer together to essentially infiltrate the entirety of a building and then out to the site and the community as a whole. So those I'll leave it there given the time constraints, but those were my main points. So I'll just unshare that. And
Thank you.
Karen.
Okay, thanks, Kath. That was really good. Thank you. Okay, so our last speaker, Ian Taylor. So Ian, have you got your presentation ready?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I'll
Thanks.
just put that on the screen now. Okay, well, I just want to, can you hear me, Karen? Is the microphone on?
Yes, I can. Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm going to pick up and cover some of the similar ground, but try and put it in a context of the world and the crisis that we're in, and also the overall collaborative nature of design and the fact that landscape and buildings have to be designed in tandem at the outset of a project, always thinking about how people are going to use those spaces. And so firstly, I'll look at the climate emergency, and in particular the biodiversity emergency, issues around changing weather, species loss, the fact that we've got to design landscapes to actually adapt to changing weather conditions in the future and protect people using those spaces from rain and sunlight. And then through some examples of projects, just identify some of the themes in which the building and landscape design can pick up on the character and biodiversity of a particular location and encourage healthier lifestyles. And finally, just a discussion of how these interrelate, and in particular towards a zero carbon future. So firstly, on the climate issues, as Karen mentioned right at the outset, today is World Environment Day. The UN have a lot of information. It's worth looking at their site. But in particular, I think it's this issue that we are mistreating our ecology. And we need to work towards different ways of improving our relationship with it and making us work with it and it work for us. The theme this year is biodiversity in particular. And there's a statement on the site around the fact that our consumption at the moment would require 1.6 Earths to sustain it. So we're 60% over consuming on the limits that the world can provide for us. So not only are we creating climate change, but we're actually overusing our environment. And I think there are very clear links that are emerging through the COVID-19 pandemic, that the relationship of how we're accessing landscape and what we're doing to landscape is increasing the risk of pandemics of this type. So firstly, just a slightly dour slide, and there are a few graphs in this, so I apologize for that. There's going to be pictures in the middle. But this statement of 1.6 worlds needed is based up on a methodology for establishing how much world surface area is needed to produce agricultural products, livestock, fishery and aquaculture, timber, the CO2 emissions, and the impact of built up surfaces, which is the man-made environment. And when you look at that and you tot it all up, there was a tipping point in just before 1970 when we started to overconsume overall. And you can see there that some of these impacts are remaining constant, but the impacts of cropland, mainly for meat consumption, and the carbon impacts are dramatically changing. And the allocation of that world's resource varies enormously between different societies. I've indicated here ourselves, which are about 3.5 worlds needed, and the USA. And luckily, if you like, for our own survival, there are countries which are not consuming to that level, but not luckily for them. So clearly there are serious issues in a range of countries in the world where the standard of living is simply not acceptable. And we've got to even this out, and it's an enormous responsibility for us to make sure that we find new ways to deal with this. In the UK then, our 3.5 planets, the footprint allocations are around energy, transport, a large amount for the food, goods and services, government and infrastructure. And so I think the important thing here is just realizing that it's not just the buildings, there's a whole issue of lifestyle that we've got to address. And having good access to landscape and using the landscape wisely is a really important issue for us going forwards. So the character of that landscape and how we inhabit it and make it good for our lives is critical. This is an image from the Yorkshire Sculpture Park where we've done a number of buildings. But as Kath was mentioning, that interface next to buildings is really important, and how buildings look out on landscape, but also the edges that allow people to meet. And clearly this is a site that we would hope we will be able to return to next year, perhaps at the end of next year. Some of you will be aware of the Accordia housing project that won the Stirling Prize in 2008. This was a collaborative project with Landscape Architects Grant Associates. But landscape was fundamental to this project in the layout, and also in not only the design of these public spaces where the predominant use is left over for people, not vehicles, but also in the design of the house types. So the left-hand image here is actually the garage, if you like. There's a car just there, and it's just a covered area which links through to the garden. So if you don't have a car, you can take it over as usable space. You can make it a living room. You could even build a new room in it for a relative or for more space. The rooms themselves look out to landscape, and there are gardens and places to grow food within the property, but you're looking out onto public landscape. In the school design, as already very clearly described by John and Kath, and referenced to in Andy's presentation, the relationship to landscape is a fundamental part of the school environment. This is Sir Mary Magdalene Academy on the Liverpool Road in Islington, where it sits opposite a churchyard with enormous trees. So there's a very dramatic, formal facade facing the public realm, a civic presence. And then every other part of the site, which was very constrained, had to be used well. So there's a Muga on the roof of the assembly hall, and accessible roofs with beetle houses and environments for study in different aspects and areas of the landscaping of the gardens. This is William Perkins School in Ealing, and it's really important that buildings and landscape respond to that location. This was a fantastic row of poplars, which you can see if you're going out on the road towards Oxford. And it was the design principle for the whole circulation of the school. So behind that 4-story high window, there's the central circulation that looks out onto these trees. Another school in Oundle was arranged around a pond, which was a small pond was already on the site, and this was enlarged. Rainwater drains into the pond through the spouts. The whole storytelling that you can engage with, because of the particular character and biodiversity of the site, is really the starting point of our occupation of it. This is Stanbrook Abbey in Yorkshire, and a building with the landscape, all those spaces for quiet contemplation and engagement with the world, alongside use of reed beds and biodiversity, to really make a building that sits calmly in the landscape. This building you may be aware of. It's an Arup Associates building called Gateway House that Field & Clay Bradley Studios this year have done a renovation project on, which has just got planning approval. But this was built in the late 70s, and all the office spaces are arranged with access out onto roof terraces, and it was the roof gardens themselves that are listed on this building. The Hive, which is for the first public library, university and combined public library in Worcester, designed on a floodplain. So making sure that the landscape design and the way people walk across it and to the building immediately puts people in contact with the landscape of that particular place. This is one of the largest schemes that we're currently involved with, which is creating the first new public landscape space in Manchester. And then one of the smallest, which is the first passive house university building at the University of Oxford. This is for Kellogg College, where simple decisions around where to place the building, how the existing trees will shade it in the summer, where to draw air into it for ventilation, all strongly relate to the landscape setting. Food growing then, as already mentioned, is absolutely key, not only for homes and schools, but this is a student housing development in Seattle, in Washington, where, because there are lots of graduate accommodation, the graduate students wanted to and set up an urban farm, and it was a core element which the student rooms were arranged around. And at One Brighton, which is the first One Planet living community near Brighton Station, there are 1 square metre allotments on the gardens, which are rented by residents, always oversubscribed, and enormously beneficial to the character of the community. So how can these different issues be brought into the design process early on? And through the One Planet Living project at One Brighton, we got to understand these 10 principles, which I think I'd certainly recommend to people to look at. And there are a group of 5 around health, economy and culture, and land and nature, and all these interrelate, as already discussed, and alongside issues of water, while and food, while the traditional issues of low carbon sustainable design, carbon waste materials, transport are also there. But it's how these all join up and interrelate, and also interrelate to the Sustainable Development Goals, which we've got to be very mindful of. Everything is joined up. And so to use this as a way of making sure that landscape and the benefits of landscape get into the design process at the outset of a project and are discussed with communities is necessary. How whole communities have to be designed with landscape. It's interesting that Paris is now thinking of becoming a 15-minute city. Everyone should have access within a certain area. I live in Islington, which is actually one of the greenest boroughs in London. The squares in the late Georgian period and other parks providing fantastic resource locally for people in a very densely populated area. And so seeing how these issues relate and how a lot of them join back into landscape is really valuable. Just some other quick examples. This is a small scheme for King's College in Cambridge, which is a passive house student housing scheme. But there are fundamental issues around site planning, which have also been touched on with access to sunlight, where the orientation of buildings is not only affecting the access to daylight for the spaces, but also significantly influencing cooling and heating requirements inside the buildings. And so all these things have to be taken account of right at the outset of the design process. Orientation of windows, whether you're looking into the sun or away from the sun, affect the thermal performance of the building. I'd recommend the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide as a really good source book of guidance that shows the linkages between these issues. And also the fact that we now have to design across the whole life cycle stages, not just the outset, those product issues, before things get to site, the A1, A2 and A3, but everything through the operation and end of use life of the products. And in terms of embodied carbon, as here under item 8, what are the impacts of all those materials that are used for the hard landscaping of our landscaping, everything that's hidden underground, and also obviously the irrigation and soft landscaping that we need in order to create the environments that we'd all like to live within. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ian. That was really interesting, and I think the presentations, you know, they all added something. They sort of brought different sort of perspectives to the conversation. Really, we have a question. Yeah, we've got a question. So this is on schools. So the question is, with limited budgets, what can schools do to make their outside spaces inspiring learning spaces? John, would you like to have a go at answering that?
Yeah, I mean, we had a big chat about this, didn't we, last week? And we were sort of saying, what about if they take the areas, some areas, and let them go wild? Maybe look at the maintenance of those school grounds, whether it's, you know, they're spending a lot of money on maintenance. Maybe do not maintain and actually allow students and pupils into those areas to explore them. I mean, what a fantastic way to engage with nature. And then look at some very simple things. Kath, you mentioned just simply by providing a seat, just gives somebody that opportunity to get out of a building and go and sit somewhere, maybe take in some rays of sunshine, but also we could do that within the greater landscape and actually just provide somebody with just a little sitting area where they can actually start to sort of engage in quietness, which Andy mentioned earlier as well as being really important, and just to start to listen to what's around them and just have that different experience.
Yeah, and I think also, John, that, you know, this planting is a relatively cost-effective element to introduce, and you know, you could look at parent groups or local community groups in terms of helping to fund maybe some of those initiatives, and just thinking about how you do planting and maybe the density of it and what works in terms of encouraging biodiversity, and say with birds or whatever, if you provide some cover, so then you potentially get some nesting birds, and so you're getting, you know, that variety of biodiversity that then becomes really interesting and it enlivens the space. So, you know, by bringing it into a community project or something, then maybe you can it can be a reasonably low cost way of implementing it.
That's a really good way of doing it, isn't it? Sorry, Kath.
Sorry. I was going to say as well, from a planting perspective, things like spring bulbs have an amazingly powerful way to uplift how you feel. Just, you know, as we come out of winter, we've all had the long nights, and I personally find that, you know, as spring bulbs come popping up through the ground, that is the start of the warmer season. Things are changing, and it makes you feel good about yourself, and it's exciting to watch, whether you're a child or whether you're a grown up. And, you know, that's another cost-effective way of bringing school grounds to life. Yeah,
and so with something like you're saying about bulbs, you know, maybe that can be part of the children can get involved with that and actually be planting those bulbs, and then there's more buy-in then, and it's sort of, you know, it's not just about somebody else putting the landscaping in. You're actually, you know, part of the process.
And lends itself to the academic year where, you know, in the peak of summer, children aren't at school, but in springtime, when those come to life, you know, they're all there, you know, in the thick of the school term.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Okay. Sorry, does anyone else want to chip into that? Sorry, John.
No, I was just saying that's just a really good idea, really positive, and it, you know, it's as you say, that when they flower, they just bring that that hope and that good feeling of spring coming, summer coming eventually. I think, yeah, Karen, what you were saying about community groups and parents getting involved, we've looked at a few schemes and where there's been very, very little budget. And I think it's just really important to look at how things could be constructed and how you could get parents and students involved in those relatively cheap projects. There'll always be somebody that could knock up a bit of timber work together to make a seat or to make an area where children can sit. And it could be that I've recently just found an old planter wall, and I thought it was quite inappropriate for where it was. And I just thought, if we got some timber, we could just make that into a seat. So we could find some parents maybe that have an interest in that sort of thing to put this thing together, and then you've got like community buy-in. We're looking at the real cheap end of landscape design, but that it's really important to get people engaged in what they're doing and in those spaces.
Okay. There's another question here, which I think is really interesting and something that I'm personally really interested in. Question is, good to hear that ground maintenance is being mentioned, as this has huge impacts on biodiversity. Do you think there is a danger in over-designing an education landscape? What about rewilding? Rewilding is just so amazing. So, I don't know. Who does Kath? Do you want to come in on that?
Well, I would have thought it's about balance. So we've already talked a little bit today about creating different scales of place, different environments for different personalities to go and sit in amongst. And I would have thought in terms of biodiversity and from an aesthetic point of view, it's about variety. So maybe it's about wilding part of a site, but it's also having some formality in other places, and that would then lend itself to different ways of teaching. You can connect to the curriculum in different ways. So I think it's about giving people options and about variety.
John, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would agree with that as well. I was ranting earlier on because all these verges that have been left wild over the lockdown period are starting to be cut in Birmingham anyway, and I was just like, oh no, we're going to lose all those species. So it's looking. I walk around the park every day and I see everything cut, and I think, why can't they just leave the edges wild? There are problems with that. There's dog fouling and all sorts of things, but it does make such a difference. And because it's just happened, because they've left everything wild, there's loads of flowers out there, and I think people appreciate that. So I'm just hoping there's going to be a movement to looking at this and maybe cutting them down as meadows at the right times in the future, and obviously leaving a lot of grass for amenity use as well in places, parkland and schools as well.
Okay, does anyone else want to contribute to that?
I can add one thing actually to it, which is to say that the idea of rewilding and sort of over-designing, actually one aspect of over-designing is to try and anticipate exactly how spaces will be used and not to leave any space for people to shape them or make them into what they want. And so sometimes we make life a bit harder for ourselves than we need to by trying to do everything for the users. And a lot of the time it's the facilities to come in and make things and play and fill those gaps that actually make something feel so much more lively and nourishing.
I think that's a really interesting take on that. Yeah, really good.
I also think
okay, we have another. Sorry, yeah, Ian. Sorry.
I was going to say that there's a certain presumption that rewilding gives a certain type of landscape, but depending on where you are, it will be a different type of landscape. And I think that's something very special about the idea of leaving things that become very specifically biodiverse, representing that particular climate and space.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think and I completely take Kath's point about it being having rewilding where it's appropriate. It's not always appropriate, but I think it's a movement not a movement, but an approach that is really interesting and has huge benefits. So it's probably for larger areas really, but it's a really exciting approach. Got another question. They're very topical. If a pandemic virus presents itself again, and being so important for our health to spend time outside, what is the future of public spaces? Are you thinking about in-between public spaces design? Could this be driving the future of urbanisation? Does anybody want to chip in here?
Well, certainly I think that the whole issue about how much space is left for areas to walk and cycle is changing. I'm sure in towns and cities around the country there'll be more space created, and the priority will be given over to people on foot rather than vehicles. And so that in itself will start to have a really big impact, and hopefully a permanent one.
Yeah, really positive, and really positive in terms of the sort of climate change agenda as well, in terms of prioritising cycling and walking over the car use. Does anybody else want to?
I can add a little bit of perspective on this. Obviously, I'm not in public space design, but I can comment a little bit on the way that the pandemic is changing our attitudes a bit. And one thing to note is that actually in pandemics in other countries, it hasn't had that much of a lasting effect. So one question will be whether we just reset back to how we were and pretend this never happened. And it may be that what I think we'll see is the things that will stick will be things that people wanted to do anyway, and these provide excuses to do them, which can be for good or can be for bad. So we may see working from home because people wanted to anyway, and it saves on office costs rather than because it's essential, but other things may snap back because we actually want to go back to Premier League football matches or whatever it might be. And I think that there's a question about outside and inside space, and there's also an interesting question about silent spaces, because one of the things that may lead to more transmission is talking and singing together. So choirs and concerts and football, it seems to be more risky than sitting quietly in a garden together. But there'll be a lot of these behavioural questions. But the underlying thing with all of it that we're having to ask ourselves, and is a theme when I talk to all of the people in our workshops and webinars, is trying to focus on what's important. And actually, if there are risks attached to doing something, the question becomes how much do you want to do it? And the things that we end up prioritizing should be in some way, I think, linked to the things that we think are good for our minds, the things that we think are beneficial to our well-being, that help us to have the kind of lives we want. And those kinds of accidental peripheral things that we find ourselves doing without really quite choosing to or knowing why we do it may be the things that start to drop away, and we focus on a few key things that are worth the risk.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at that, and questioning what we're doing and how we get out of lockdown and how things move forward. One thought I think John and I had a conversation about was actually using, in terms of if you're wanting to sort of separate people or define routes so that people can be more easily separated, then using natural landscaping is one way to do that. So rather than putting up barriers and stuff, using natural landscape, and actually you can still see people, but it creates a bit of a barrier between people, and can be done in a so you're also looking at biodiversity at the same time and all the benefits that landscaping can bring to that. Okay, does anyone else want to add any more to that question? No? Okay. All right then. Well, we haven't got any more questions from the audience, but I think probably it's a good time to wrap up. Thank you to everyone for your really interesting presentations and discussions, and thanks to the audience for joining us. I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Karen, as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Karen.